thanks to the venue here, which is part of UCL. So it's their base KX, where I think they have some incubation space and they help startups and all the rest of it. So they're great guys to let us have this event here. And I'd also like to thank, we've got a couple of sponsors this evening. You'll see banners here from thoughtbot, and also Gerard here from Rational IP is also helping us. So we have these guys to help to thank for the drinks, and also they'll be answering questions for a few minutes. So what I wanted to do, I should probably just mention, by the way, there were no fire alarms planned this evening. So if there is a fire alarm, that's a emergency exit there, and the other emergency exit is the one that you came in through at the beginning of the So what we wanted to do this evening was that talk a little bit about, in a way, how the startup world is changing towards deep tech, and what that really means in terms of how startups are created and how ultimately they become successful and commercialized. And so in the good old days of consumer internet, we'd often have an audience a bit like yourselves, of maybe founders who were trying to develop a consumer internet startup, and we could refer them to something like the lean startup methodology, and life was relatively simple. But I think as we get into this area of deep tech and AI, machine learning, etc., we're seeing far more people coming out of academia, bright PhDs, working on very complex things, and therefore the cycle becomes longer, and there become a lot more different issues that we have to address in commercializing these types of startups. And in many ways, the book hasn't really been written on this yet, so you can't just pick up a manual and learn how to do some of this stuff. So hopefully these guys here are going to be able to answer some of the questions around this, but I think this is also a little bit about picking your brains as well, and trying to we're all on a steep learning curve as far as this area is concerned, and learning a little bit from you guys what you really need in terms of support and mentoring, and any thoughts you have in terms of how startups will be developed in the future. So we've got a great panel here with Steve and sorry, let me just. Steve, Laurie, I've known these guys for years, by the way.
Only sort of around 12 years. So.
Steve, Laurie, Nick, and Gerard. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get each of them to introduce themselves, first of all, for a couple of minutes. So maybe you could start, Steve.
Okay, so I'm Steve Everhard. Good evening. So my background goes back a long way in technology. When I started out, microprocessors were 4 bits. 256 bytes of memory was a huge amount of space to work in. So things have come on a little way since then. And I've spent quite a lot of my career in businesses where intellectual property was the central proposition. Initially, I spent 10 years with Apple during a very interesting time, and even during that period, we were looking at how we commercialize intellectual property inside Apple. The door slammed on that opportunity. I spent about 5 years inside MasterCard, running a subsidiary of MasterCard, doing similar kind of thing, intellectual property around cryptography. And in particular, the things that make your credit card work, which is kind of nice, or not in some cases. So IP and if you like, the bleeding edge of technology has been something that I've been associating for a long time. Right now, I'm a visiting fellow at the Royal College of Art. I work with their innovation unit, see a lot of startups, work with startups outside of that situation as well. Do some investment, and I hear a huge number of stories, which is good. So that's me.
Okay, Laurie.
Yep. So my background, I started out at Imperial, so I've got an academic background, like I think a bunch of you here do. I started in physics. I spent 4 years doing my undergraduate degree in physics before I transitioned into a mix of physics and computing for my PhD, where I was looking at what was then considered a really hard data engineering problem, which was how to handle the amounts of data that were coming out of CERN, which was generating amounts of data which at the time we thought was staggeringly large. Now we probably think of as small enough to fit on a hard disk at home because times have changed. So I spent 5 years looking at how do you manage taking those algorithms, taking those data sets, processing them and passing them on, before I left academia and went into the industry space, where I've mostly been working in an agency. I've been at thoughtbot pretty much since I left university 10 years ago now, looking at working with companies that are building digital products. So that's any form of technology that interacts with end users, which ultimately is any sort of technology in some form or another. And most of that time I've been thinking about what's the right way to take the idea and refine the idea to make sure that whatever it is you're building is the thing that your customers actually want, the thing that your customers, your users are going to enjoy using, that's going to solve their problems, and that's going to be viable as a business, because there's no point building something that no one wants to use or that people want to use but isn't available at a price point or a packaging that's actually useful to them.
Nick?
Hi, I'm Nick. Day in, day out, I build web and mobile applications at thoughtbot. I've helped run projects and whatnot as well. Prior to thoughtbot, I founded my own startup in the gym class space, where we built lots of stuff that didn't really go anywhere, but we did raise some money during that process. And I spend all my time with founders and small and medium-sized companies, and currently quite a large publicly listed company which I'm working with at the moment.
Gerard.
I'm Gerard. I'm a chartered patent attorney. I specialize in software patents. My background is in computer science and law, which I think is quite common. I started off working with all the larger companies like Unisys and Hewlett-Packard and Nokia, but I now work with a lot of technology startups, well over 100 technology startups. In terms of artificial intelligence, if you've seen Lord of the Rings, you might recall some of the massive battle sequences in those. Each of those characters is actually an artificially intelligent simulated creature, and I prepared and filed the patent applications for those.
Great, thanks very much. So I think you'll agree, we've got a great panel. So think of questions quite, we're going to be asking for questions from the audience quite early on, because I want to get plenty of time and give plenty of opportunity for you guys to ask questions. I think, but before we get into that though, maybe if each of you guys could talk a little bit about what you think is the main challenge facing deep tech founders in this kind of new world we're entering into, and just say a few words from your point of view, what you think is the biggest challenge. Maybe start again with Steve.
Okay. Well, as with all of these things, the problem is not with what would appear to be the fundamental element of technology, but it's the infrastructure that sits around it. AI in itself, not a great deal of value, depends very much on the data that it's leaning on in order to do its analysis. Bad data, we were talking about this earlier, crap in, crap out, that's the way it works, it always has done in computing, and there is no better case for that than AI. So I think that the challenge is the appropriate application of that tool alongside the appropriate application of other tools, and not thinking that it's some kind of magic bullet that delivers a solution. Just as with any technology, one of my favorite bugbears is blockchain, but we won't get onto that. Is that you need to figure out exactly what this is delivering for your customer. Without a customer, it's not a business; it's a project.
That's a very good point, Laurie.
Yeah, I would say the biggest challenge in deep tech in all its various forms is separating the reality from the hype. Taking the difference between what people think it will be able to do and what it actually can do. I think there's a lot of people who don't fully understand what is possible, and so come up with ideas that are like a long way beyond what's possible, or they have challenges around how much data you can gather that are astronomical, and they think, well, I've done a little bit of research and that's going to be sufficient. That proves the point, I can do a bit more, but actually the data gathering tasks might be years if they don't do them correctly. So yeah, separating the hype from the reality
One of the problems you get with lots of technology startups is that mostly founded by either developers or people who have the ability to design or build software. And something that we all fall into the trap of is just building too much of it before testing it in front of users. And I've done the same multiple times. And the trick is to not build too much and lean on other stuff that you can use from different services first, and then really test that product as early as you can.
I'm going to say one of the challenges facing growing a deep tech startup is very similar to other startups, and that is survival. And you're facing competition, not just from other startups providing similar technologies, but you're facing competition in raising funding as well. So you're not just up against similar startups, up against every startup. So I see that as one of the key issues.
I want to come straight back to Gerard and really talk about the fact that a lot of these deep tech startups will come out of universities, and universities often have quite strong policies around who owns the IP. And what I really want to ask is, are there ways of dealing with this? How best can startups deal with the fact that the university may already own large parts of the IP?
So this will depend to a certain extent on the policies that the university has in place. Many of them may actually state that a lot of your graduate work you do own the intellectual property in. Often if there's some kind of funding that's provided by the university for that specific project, or a supervisor's input has been provided to a high level, there might be intellectual property issues. You encounter particular difficulties if funding comes from outside the university. So I would say that in a lot of circumstances, a number of universities, a lot of the graduate work may in fact be owned by the student. In those circumstances where there are university policies that state ownership is to be held by the university does have commercialization departments. It can be difficult. They can be difficult to work with, but the possibility exists for a collaborative approach to building a spin-out tech startup with university commercialization department's assistance. The other area that I can think of is that if you're doing work that's been part of your thesis, that's been published, yes, that might not be something that you may own. However, subsequent work that is done outside the umbrella of the university, that can very well be your own, because it's built on top of the work, but the new material, the new innovations will be innovations that you might have complete ownership of.
Quick show of hands, who here feels that this might be a problem for them? Who's working on projects within university? Yes?
Yes, I'm in a little bit of a transition, I guess you could say, because I will own all the IP that I've already done, but any new developments having come on to the university contracts will then be.
Yeah, it's a reverse situation.
Yeah.
Right, well, you should probably talk later, but thanks for flagging that. Anybody else is working on university projects in here at the moment? Everybody else is really owning their own IP, yeah? Good. Steve, did you see this in the university spin-outs that you've talked
Yeah, a lot. I think the other challenge that you've got is that if you're looking for patentable technologies, then your thesis may be a challenge for you. Because once that information is published, it's very difficult to patent. So one of the things you need to do is to work with your university to figure out what needs to be in your patent and what can be excluded, what needs to be in your thesis and what can be excluded in order to give you a patentable opportunity. Shows are another example of that. You know, when you have technology shows inside universities, particularly at MA and PhD level, you've got to be very careful what you expose, right? There are ways of blinding the kind of clever stuff, you know, sticking that in a box to make sure that it's not easily derivable from somebody viewing what you want to do, because you're trying to attract attention. At the same time, you can't expose the clever stuff. Once you've done that, then if there is a patent potential, then you've kind of blown that.
I would just add one caveat to that, which is in some countries, there is actually a grace period following disclosure, where if you have accidentally or intentionally disclosed material, that you would want to subsequently patent, you can still obtain patent protection. Those countries are few and far between, but notably amongst them is the United States. There's a 12-month grace period in the United States.
So another question to the audience. How many people here are building tech or particularly have a challenge in terms of how to build a tech, finding a CTO, finding a supplier on tech or anything of that kind of nature? One at the back there? Yes, quite a few actually, yes. So what I wanted to ask Laurie actually was that there are obviously various routes to acquiring tech within a startup. So you can acquire your own CTO, you can build a team, etc., etc. But of course you have to have capital to do that. The alternative is to go to some form of agency or a company that can help you with this. And often in the days of the consumer internet, I would tell people, not to use agencies because you won't be able to control the situation. It's hard to do iteration and work in an agile way. Particularly if you get it wrong at the first time round, every time you reiterate, it's going to cost more and more money. So what I want to ask Laurie, quite a tricky question maybe, how would thoughtbot differ in this respect in terms of helping startups to iterate products?
Yeah, so I think the trick for anyone who wants to work with an agency to build a product is to try and avoid the trap of trying to specify everything you want the agency to do upfront, because you'll never know less about what you want to build than at the starting point of the project. You'll only ever know more as you go through the process. And so it's really important to work in an iterative way, as Paul says. That way you can refine the idea and work and generally have a partnership and work together to get to the right place. If you have a arrangement whereby you've got one thing in mind and you contractually specify that, then you've actually created a conflict of interests between you and the agency. It's in your interest to say that as much as possible is included in that agreement. It's in the agency's interest to deliver it for the minimum possible price because they're paying whatever price they have to pay for getting a fixed amount. Whereas if you can align the interests so you can both say, let's build the right thing in the shortest possible time, then it's a much better working relationship.
Really a sort of tangential question really to Nick, really. So in doing this, one would traditionally create a startup in a very iterative manner. So you would really based on something like the lean methodology. So you'd discover a problem, you would find problem solution fit, you would create an MVP, you'd prove product market fit. Is this still relevant in a deep tech world, and how do you think it needs adapting to address much more complex startups that might be looking at something like artificial intelligence or machine learning, where maybe the cycles are longer and it takes longer to know whether you're on the right track or not?
It depends what you build during that MVP. So the crux being with lean is that, say, like a 6-week cycle where you build something, put it in front of a bunch of users. That you can do stuff like, if you're building a chatbot, for example, you don't need to have AI there. You could just have a person behind the computer and then they can just respond to people, and that will scale for quite a while before it no longer works. You can have quite a lot of stuff going on. It's like a support desk scenario, and that will work for quite a while. And it's similar with, say, voice activated things and image recognition based things. Google Cloud Platform provides stuff like that. So does AWS, and Azure and all the others do something very similar. So you can lean on not building any, you can lean on building as little tech as possible is the easiest way to do that. And then you really focus on getting that user feedback through your development cycles.
I'm going to come back to Steve in a minute about the sort of capital raising aspect of it. But first of all, who sees this as a potential issue? Right. Do you want to say something on it?
Yeah, so I mean, my particular vertical may be a very tough one in the entertainment space, and we've been using computers to do computational creativity and make animated movies. So all of these things are very, very expensive. And from an MVP perspective, it's very unclear what one is supposed to build. And we've actually been on sites for a very long time where, you know, you talk to the Valley and they say things like, well, you're overbuilding because you really should just, you know, wither it off the whole thing. Whereas if you talk to the gaming community or the film industry and they want to see a fully fledged thing, because that's the currency that they work with, and they're not unused to spending $10 million on a hunt.
Yeah.
So there's a cultural thing that we've suffered, independent of the fact that we're actually trying to do very, very complicated AI stuff at the same time.
I mean, what would you do if you had a client with that particular issue?
First thing that I would think of is if you're doing some sort of automatic creation of content, presumably you've got several steps in there. If you're doing movies, then you've got scripting, lighting, casting, acting, editing, a whole bunch of other stuff that I probably wouldn't guess at as well. Could you pick just one of those things and say, let's start off by automating that bit and adding some AI into that bit, keep the rest as it is, and then maybe that will reduce your costs enough that you're now more competitive than some of your competitors, and then you can ride that to take on the other things. Would that work?
It's a long, it's a long and nuanced conversation.
You mean it's not as simple as that?
Yeah. I should just show them some financials. I mean, they spend what millions of dollars by editing Henry Cavill's mustache from Superman v Batman, whereas this guy used basically deep fake and then just did the same thing for like $20,000. Can't you just show them financials like that and just say that?
Again, it depends a lot on what you consider to be your product, what you consider to be your customer, what you consider to be your business model.
There you go.
Right.
You're asking your own questions, really. It's you know, first of all, I'd never take an entertainment product to the Valley. You know, you're way too far north, or you're on the wrong coast, depending on how you look at it. But it's not a place where you're going to find a welcome, and you're going to be taken in all kinds of directions you don't want to be taken in.
Oh my God, yeah.
So that's one thing. The other thing is to figure out what your product is, and that's going to change, right? I mean, as you go through the process, what is your product will change. The mistake a lot of people make when they're starting out on the journey is not understanding what the impact of the infrastructure they need to live in is. So I worked with a startup about 6 years ago, and they had a brilliant solution for automated software builds. What they neglected to realize is that the environment that they'd constructed was not an environment that was common. In which case you're basically trying to persuade everybody to move everything that they're doing into a different kind of situation in order to take advantage. That doesn't work. So you need to understand the context in which you're working, and then figure out what your product is inside that, and try not to invent anything that you can lean on, which I think is kind of the advice that you've been given is, you know, don't reinvent everything just because you can. You know, make sure that you're focusing on those things where there's true value for your customer, and then you know, obviously you need to figure out who your customer is as well.
I mean, we obviously have done a lot of that.
Yeah, I'm sure you have.
You know.
Yeah.
To run with the build tools example, those who have successfully delivered something like a build tool into a development organization have usually brought with them a methodology for building software with it, and it just happens to be a piece of software that came with them, and that's the value that they provide, and the software just is just a thing that's hanging on to it as such. And I can imagine that for lots of different industries, there is a similar parallel that you could take.
Is the problem raising money, or is the problem like customers?
The problem has been raising money. I mean, actually, it's a sort of a catch-22 because our customers are very, very large organizations, right? And the lead times on those sales are very long. And I mean, Valley aside, where everyone just written down a consumer funnel, and then it's like anything over 3 months is too long. But
actually, can I just open that question up a little bit, because I think that I mean, my question really is about patient capital or something of that nature, because I think if we start to look at AI and machine learning and maybe looking at complex health screening or whatever, those projects do take longer to generate revenues. And so maybe Steve, you could comment a little bit on how you see, how is this problem going to get addressed ultimately?
I think it's really going to get addressed by governments more than it is by financial institutions, because it's only governments that have got patience really for long payback periods. The difficulty you get into as soon as you accept money from someone is you're really on their agenda. And it's hard to avoid that. I mean, you can do it by setting up a kind of constellation of investors, which limits each investor's impact on your business. But at the end of the day, that they can gang together and drag you in a direction you don't want to go in. So in terms of patient capital, it's more likely to come as a strategy from governments or from the European Union, who are have been looking at this for quite some time, as a way of figuring out. You okay over there? Right? That is good. What if we had to drag you out? So yeah. I mean that's the challenge. Once you accept money, of course you're on somebody else's treadmill, and that can be a problem too, because you're going to get pushed in directions that you don't always want to go in. Not least of which is if you take institutional money, you got to spend that cash within a certain period of time, and that's why companies balloon and implode.
Yes, I mean, who in the audience is sort of capital raising at the moment? Quite a lot, actually. Is anybody seeing this particularly as a problem in terms of? Yes, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a gross mischaracterization. I mean, I sat down and did numbers on what a training run would take and cost. What do you think? How long do you think training run would? It's an NLP based problem, right? And it would take about 2 weeks from Google Cloud, right, which costs about £18,000. That's not the real cost. The real cost is nobody's working for 2 weeks. You're waiting for the training run to finish.
Have you read this paper?
That was very fortuitous.
Yeah.
It's a good paper.
It's a good paper. We should see it.
Well, I mean, in theory, it does work.
In theory.
So on the development side, do you feel that the startups that are going to approach you are going to have the capital to do the development they need to do?
It varies.
Yeah.
We certainly see some people come in who don't have the capital they need to get started, and we try and say, right, what do you have, and maybe there's something we can do to get you to the point where you can get more capital with what you've got already. We see people who've got a chunk of capital but have to be really careful in how they spend it, because it's probably about what they need to get started, but not much more. So it's really important that it gets spent in the right way to give them the most impact. I'd love to say we see loads of people who have way more capital than they need, but that doesn't happen too often.
True.
Yeah.
Okay. How many people in the audience are thinking about data being a big challenge? I mean, one would expect it, being AI and machine learning and that being the topic. And really, this is just a question about data sets. How many people are being kept awake at night thinking about how they're going to find the data sets they're going to need to develop their business? Anybody?
Actually,
There's
it's
a
more a
few.
case of getting that financed.
Sorry?
It's getting the data acquisition financed.
So the data you're acquiring, somebody's selling?
No. You usually have to create it yourself.
It's going to cost you some time and money to create the data,
Correct.
and
Finance
that's the block.
When you go to VCs and you say, this is what we want to do, they go,
And that's somewhere where the lean approach is quite a challenge, right? You can easily create a small data set, but it's not much use.
Yeah. So it kind of sounds like the big problem here is raising money, right? It's the fundraising stage. How do you sell a proposition to potential investors? And I think that if you've got a problem which is going to take a long time to solve, then you've got a really big problem on your hands. But if things can be chunked up into smaller phases, where the product development for the animation studio can be delivered in phases, then that's an easier sell to potential investors, or where the data acquisition can be broken into various stages. So it's kind of like a melding of the lean approach with sort of kind of traditional old school, go away and sit in the bunker for 20 years and turn up with your product all solved. So I think the problem is selling these propositions to the investors and chunking up into stages with potential revenues at the end of each stage, I think is interesting. Another way to kind of sell this proposition is by identifying potential intellectual property or actual intellectual property in your technology. Because one of the questions investors are going to want to know the answer to is, if I sink money into your business, what's to stop another company turning up with more money from another investor and making the same play? So there's a way that you can turn around and say, we have potential monopoly rights here somehow, whether with patents, whether with trade secrets, whether with something else, then that is kind of a way to strengthen that proposition to the investor. And it's a way to maximize the value of your company for that fundraising round.
It's certainly the case that if you can develop a product where the acquisition of data is a secondary component, I mean, it might be your primary goal, but is a secondary component, then that might be an easier way of first of all, getting some funding because you're adding value to your market earlier on. And also it gives you some kind of breathing space and exposure to that collection of data as you go. In many situations, you can develop a tool or a utility that provides value into the market you're trying to serve, but at the same time gives you a data source, which you then can collect and validate as a kind of secondary component to what you do, rather than think, I've got to go and find the data from somewhere or the other. So if you can add value during that process, then clearly there is potentially a revenue stream in that whole exercise.
An approach like that also helps a lot with what Jared was saying about when you get to either investment or a later stage investment, and investors will naturally be worried what to prevent them from copying this play. If you've got a track record of identifying value, figuring out what to build, getting that in front of your users and building something that they love and they care about, that's an important part of how you build something. And the investors can go and find another team, but that's a team that's not yet formed, doesn't have that track record, and has to learn that, and that's going to take time. So just the learning and the approach, the skill and the experience you gain in doing that becomes part of the advantage as well.
I saw a question over there.
I think I want to understand or even pick your brains a little bit about the lay of the land when it comes to data sets and patient records. I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to actually do any kind of deep tech associated with that unless you're tied in either with a hospital or with some kind of research foundation. Do you know anything where we can navigate this kind of landscape at all, or have you heard of any news that can help us in this respect?
There are some sort of data sets like the biobank, aren't there, with the Wellcome Trust that are open source.
I mean, certainly DeepMind hasn't been your friend in that regard.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's and that's a good example, I guess, really, which is that your goals, and this is obviously being pushed by GDPR as well right now, is that you have to make sure that whatever you're doing with data is clearly communicated to your audience, and that they're part of that process in some form, or you blind the information in some way, which is very common in the health industry, because really it's the information that you need much more than the link back to the individual. A challenge for following up very often, if this is a longitudinal study, for instance, but if this is a different, more defined form of data, then it may well be possible that you can do it in that way. You've got to figure out, there's no magic bullet here. You've got to figure out a way where data flows to you rather than you go hunting for it. And that kind of validates the comments that you've heard so far. You've got to kind of pull that information to you, and you do that by adding value. And you just got to figure out what that step is. The one thing you're not going to be able to do is to build this huge bank of information on health, for instance, before you can begin to develop your solution. You're going to have to find some stepwise approach to that problem.
It strikes me that another thing you could try, and I don't know of anyone that's tried this, so take this with a pinch of salt, is to try and build a structure around that data and how you store it that not only leads the way in keeping it private, but ensures that it's protected against someone buying you for that data. And if you can build trust that you're going to do something reliable and responsible with the data, that's going to make it easier.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think there's a company called Data Biology that really tries to create the infrastructure and management of the data. And I think they'll feed you the data. Now, it doesn't answer all the questions because it doesn't, open up data sets that you don't already have, but it does at least give credibility to the way the data is being managed. So it might be worth having a look at that one. Gerard, do you have a point of view on the data question, really?
Well, I think there's a couple of points, but my question is, so you're trying to obtain patient data?
I think it was more of a hypothetical question more than anything else. I've got ideas around building deep tech in healthcare, but I wanted to see what the lay of the land was before I could actually develop anything like this.
Public sector or private sector?
Private.
Okay. Because I think that would involve definitely conversation with those providers, and they're probably more willing to move on it. In say the NHS, it might take a long time to move on patient data. But if you can, it's the same sort of problem in any space. If you can show the customer, the private sector, that you can provide a lot of value, then you're going to be able to negotiate with them about the patient data. They have their own obligations that they need to meet. Maybe they can anonymize the data, as Laurie said before, providing it to you. So to a certain extent, you deal with the problems of confidentiality and the GDPR.
I think it's a little bit part of the entrepreneurialism of startup founders. They're having to be pretty ingenious in dealing with this issue because, for example, I've heard of people, rather than taking active data, volunteering to use archive data for archiving radiology scans or something like that, where they can do something in the archive scenario which they couldn't do in the sort of live scenario. Or using large databases from big Chinese universities where maybe the rules aren't as strict, or So I think that part of the entrepreneurial journey is to find a workaround in this to some degree. I think it's just necessary to do.
There are certainly some parts of the world where you can fish where there are almost no data protection rules, and that's
I think there's actually a huge data set that's actually collected from 20 or 30 years of study. I think it's actually open sourced by the Melinda Bill Gates Foundation. It's a massive database, but it's really unstructured. There are loads of people who's actually doing their current research onto it. Maybe you can try and find it. I don't know the exact link, but I had a chance to look at it about a year and a half ago.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yes.
The question.
So maybe I can add something. I work on AI in healthcare, and so there are quite a lot of open data sets out there that are arranged generally around competitions. So if you Google medical imaging grand challenges, for example, you'll find probably 50 data sets that are out there. They might not be big enough for what you want to do, but they'll probably get you started. There is a lot of data out there in things like genomics. A lot of open data sets. There's the UK Biobank, which is hundreds of thousands of images, but mainly I think it's all healthy patients. I think there's enough to get you started. If you really want data from hospitals, that's a long process. Right? You firstly have to figure out exactly what you want. You have to engage in a contract negotiation with them. You then have to, you have to figure out exactly how you're going to avoid them being in breach of competition rules where they're giving uncompetitive advantage to you unless you're paying for the data. The issue around it all being anonymized, they won't give you data that's not anonymized, so it should be taken care of. But you need to be prepared for a long wait to get your hands on that data. I think the point that was made on the statement about getting data to flow to you, if you can get into a situation where you're doing that, you're onto a winner.
One more question for you. What's your name?
Peter Mounting.
Peter
Mounts.
Just to add to that, I mean, there are groupings like the Dementia Platform UK, which has actually gathered together cohorts of patients with dementia with Alzheimer's disease. And it might be worth, I mean, they might be prepared to do a collaboration with you because they gather all this information together. Also, other potentially charities specialising in particular diseases might be interested in a collaboration.
So definitely, I think worth speaking to Barbara and Peter later on in the networking about that subject. You've got another question?
I was just gonna kind of go from the research side. It just depends on what data that you want. Things like what Peter was saying, in the sense that be wary of collecting a bunch of data that is essentially meaningless now. So, for example, like MRI scans or something, you might get a huge cohort of people who had 1.5 Tesla MRI scanning or something like this, and it's virtually meaningless. Because then you have now the technology, you have 7 Tesla scanning. So what are you going to do with 1.5 Tesla imaging? And so that sort of thing. So be wary of like what your actual data set is going to tell you. If you do come across, large data sets, because it could be virtually meaningless.
Just another quick show of hands. Who here would see themselves as being a founder, entrepreneurial, trying to do start a business? There's quite a number of you. So just to open it up a bit, you must have some challenges that you want to maybe raise as questions. All right, is everything okay? Yes.
So talking about data coming to you, I feel like with data requested through an API, they're extremely unreliable nowadays, especially if over time they thought of your requests. They still send data to your application, but I feel like with updates and stuff, it's just a matter of maintaining the APIs over actually putting in the code to extract the data that you need. So at the moment, it's like we're battling against maintaining the APIs and making sure they integrate well with the applications that we have. But they don't, over time, it's becoming an issue actually maintaining them. So we've got data coming in and we're able to draw data from a database, for example, but it's just an issue of maintenance.
In what sort of sector are you?
You call it a chatbot, if you will.
Okay.
And you're relying on data that you're consuming from a third-party API, and the problem is that they're changing the API. Probably not weekly, but probably feels like
sent through without it even being originally promised. And it's just something that I've not been able to find a solution to at the moment.
Or you might build an application based on an API, and then the rules get changed quite extensively. Like I think LinkedIn have changed their APIs. So you might have a whole proposition based on being able to recognize people on LinkedIn, and then suddenly find you can't do it. It could be a problem. Laurie, do you come across? You must be looking at integrating APIs all the time.
We see it quite often, and it's probably what every app we work on, I think, has an API at some point, and it ties in with what Nick was saying earlier about when you start building, you can lean on other technologies, which is a great way to get started, but can be painful when you're a bit bigger. Kind of when you've got past that first stage, when you're up and running, and you've maybe got the investment, then that can start to slow you down. So the question then is there a way you can remove your dependency on that data source? I don't know your case, so maybe there is, maybe there isn't. If there is, remove the dependency. If there isn't, then maybe the best approach is just some time spent abstracting the data out from the API so it just becomes less painful to change it. Other than that, I don't think there's much else you can do.
I think one of my clients, I'm not sure if the solution would work with your problem, but it's called Import.io, and they basically act as glue between applications and third-party providers of data, and they have a number of modules that verify the interface. So if there's a problem with the changes in the interface, some of those modules can be automatically updated if they're used generically by a whole bunch of companies. So it might be worth looking into. I don't know if it makes your problem.
Yes.
So I haven't quite formulated this question, so I guess I'll see what comes out of it. But in Lean style, when you say some of the verticals that exist, consumer or whatever, there's a fairly well-defined set of stages and rounds that have been sort of evolved. In this space, the AI and machine learning space, we don't really have a well-defined round structure that I can sort of.
You must be a mind reader, because that's exactly what I was going to sort of raise as well. I think, first of all, I was going to ask how many people have read The Lean Startup. How many founders have not read The Lean Startup? Yeah, I still think everybody should read The Lean Startup in the sense of just the very simple stages that it kind of forces you to go through. But I think you're right in a way that the Lean Startup needs adapting to this new world. In fact, we were talking about this, Gerard, a few weeks ago, sort of thing. I don't know what we'll ask Pat in a moment, but I still think that you still have to work in an iterative manner, because you are just never going to be given the opportunity to go in. So it was the old Peter Thiel, 0 to 1 sort of, it's the opposite to Lean, but you have to be Peter Thiel to be allowed to have the money to do it, right? And nobody's going to give you the money to go all in, sort of thing. So I don't know what you guys think, but I still think you're going to have to go very iterative in anything you do, whether it's deep learning or whatever. It's still the basic principles of having to identify the problem, create something a bit like an MVP, and then test the market to see that people will buy it. And any disagreements on that?
Or maybe a proving example. If you look at the stuff that Facebook published, I think it was last week, about how they're using AIs to identify content that they want to remove. They started off with a vast army of human beings who are looking through stuff. They gradually started to introduce AIs to identify some of it. And in some areas, they're doing really well. In some areas, they're getting, I think it was up to 95% accuracy. And in some other areas, they were really struggling. So they can do the same approach. They can iterate. They can start with humans. They can then gradually deploy better AIs over time.
Yeah.
But
I
again,
the
they
problem
haven't
is
started quite to do that.
vast armies of humans still cost a lot of money.
Yeah.
And Facebook have that money, but if you're a startup,
You don't have that
you
money.
can't fill that gap with even human beings.
And the funding stages and so forth have changed a lot as well, especially in Europe over the last couple of years. The point in time where you might raise a Series A is shot all the way back now. So you might be in business for like nearly a decade before maybe you raise a big round from a VC firm, which is of course different in Silicon Valley. So you're already working on less money. So then it goes back to the human beings are still kind of expensive problem.
I think that's right. I think the Series A has got into a bigger round in the UK than they were, so now they're sort of 2 to 5 million or something like that. And certainly with very much stronger metrics, so you've got to have hit proper product market fit, which is quite hard to do when you're doing something that's quite hard to prove, so it's a bit different from, creating an Uber or an Airbnb, where you can quickly see that you're building users and things like that. Whereas in some of these instances, you're having to test test maybe algorithms for a long time in terms of, I don't know, spotting tumours, using machine learning. So, but I still feel that maybe there's a lot to be learned from Lean. Maybe it needs some adaptation, but I think one of the big differences is actually that the typical entrepreneur who's entering the journey in the first place, when you took the sort of classic Shoreditch consumer internet founder, they were really first and foremost business founders who had an idea and they've brought the people around them. Whereas I think in when we get to this sort of AI and machine learning, there often be a couple of PhDs getting together and creating the startup. And therefore, I think there's a stage of working out, are these people a founder team? Is that the best way should they be spending their life being entrepreneurial, or are they best deployed in some form of research which does equal good to society? And I think the soft issues around entrepreneurialism are often the most difficult ones to determine, right?
I think one of the things that AI has brought in is the whole issue of morality in technology solutions. Yeah, I remember having this discussion a number of years ago with Professor Stephen Hepple from East Anglia University, when he was saying, you know, we're at the tipping point now between can we do this and should we do this? And I think this is going to come to the fore a lot with AI-based solutions, particularly because we can see bad actors moving quickly into these markets, and it's very difficult to keep them at bay.
Slight follow-up question then. Is there an ideal founder team, sort of reflect on what you're saying, for one of these deep AI startups, right? What presents you as a credible vehicle?
Properly.
Nice, easy question.
Yeah. I'll have a stab at it. I think there's still always the that kind of mix of hustler. What's the mix? You need a salesman. You need somebody who's operationally focused. You need you need a deep techie really, and you need maybe more than one of each of those. I still feel that it wouldn't work without the basic entrepreneurial spirit within the team, and therefore you need an entrepreneurial leader. So, and I don't think that's very different from consumer internet in that respect. I think the very definition of a startup is the fact that you've got at least one person who's prepared to take kind of massive risk, actually, and the risk that is far beyond what you would take, say, as a researcher in a university.
It comes down to credibility, doesn't it, really? I mean, your team has to have credibility in the industry that you're attempting to attack one form or another. There is a bizarre obsession amongst investors on people who have done it before. And I say it's a bizarre obsession because the data doesn't support it, interestingly enough. You're no more likely to be a successful entrepreneur having done it once before than somebody who's never done it. But it does buy you airtime. It has to be said. So you can get into conversations much easier if you've got someone on your team who has walked this route before. It doesn't guarantee you of more success, but it will get you into the door on those conversations.
In my experience, the startups which tend to be quite successful, or at least one category of them, are those where one or more of the founders actually have come from the industry, so they've experienced a specific problem that they may have worked with or tried to work with in industry, and they've thought, okay, this is a problem, let us actually spin out, create a startup and create a solution. And so I think those tend to be startups which tend to be successful, and perhaps because they're best able to explain the problem and the solution to the investors, and they're best able to present themselves as credible experts to the problem that exists.
There's a lot there about empathy. So it's a case of if someone comes from the industry where they're trying to solve a problem, they can empathise with the customers. And to come back to your question about the startup team, that's also a lot about empathy. You've got a bunch of people who are working together as a team. Do they all have empathy for each other? And do they all have the same answer to the question, why are we doing this business? Because if they have different opinions there, then it kind of doesn't matter what their skill set is. They're just going to end up arguing and pulling apart.
Yeah, that's team structure. I mean, one situation that is very difficult is when you've got a PhD candidate in amongst your team. Investors don't like that. They think somebody's getting their PhD paid for.
Interesting point.
So my question is actually, is that a case of a company who started off with the mission of being AI first and is successful? I mean, let's look at it this way, right? Google, trying to solve search, was not AI first. Facebook, not AI first. Uber, not AI first. They all transformed into AI first afterwards. But now we're kind of shifting to say we're AI first at the get-go instead of trying to build a business and then become AI. Is there such a...
Isn't there a difference though between sort of core AI, like say for example DeepMind, and there's only room for a very small number of those. And then what we're seeing now is the use cases of AI, which I agree completely with you. They will come from from use cases rather than just trying to create core AI. What do you guys
I
think?
think at the moment, the advantage is that AI is commoditized. It's off the shelf and you just take it and you configure it for a specific vertical. And that's what a lot of companies are doing at the moment. That's why 30% of the companies I work with are using artificial intelligence because it solves problems for them. But they don't typically present themselves as an artificial intelligence company. They present themselves as a company that solves a specific problem. And they might be using artificial intelligence to do that because it's the best way to do it. And it's the best way at the moment because it's cheap and it works.
I mean, there's a place for tools businesses and utility businesses, most definitely. They struggle to raise money, but there's definitely a market for those things. And there are some huge organizations, some of which are Australian, that have made very nice businesses, thank you very much, from tools and utilities. But the issue here is that AI just kind of disappears into the background and is a tool that you deploy rather than an end in itself. But very much depends on what problem you're trying to predict.
I think most businesses that really succeed are really focused on who is their customer and what are they trying to do for their customer. And if they lead with that, then maybe AI is a good fit. Maybe it's not. But they're focusing on who they're serving rather than how they're serving them.
I'm sorry, actually, the question I should have asked from the start. What's your definition of AI? Is it the thing is, the way I define AI is technically if-else statements are AI, right? Do you define that as AI? Do you define machine learning as AI? Do you define deep learning as AI, or do you define as artificial general intelligence as AI? Sorry, I just wanted to clarify this point.
Personally, I would be open to most of the definitions. The kind of the working definition I tend to use in conversation is neural nets and things of that ilk. And I know AI is a lot broader than that, but that's kind of what I have in mind when I use the phrase.
Yeah, I struggle with seeing decision trees really as AI, to be honest. Because we've been walking those things for forever. And really all that you're doing is quantifying a problem into stages that you understand. And for me, it's how do you deploy all of those tools when whatever system it is put into a situation where it encounters a data set it's not seen before. And then, what happens at that point? A case in point really is the Uber accident recently, where all of the information was available to their system to avoid this woman crossing the road with a trolley of stuff. It's just that the decision point in all of that was big chunks of paper don't walk across the road. So you're okay going straight through that, right? And at no point was the decision made that this was a complex problem that would not compute. And so it's a classic example of this if then else, right? You bounce through the whole thing, else just keep going, right? And that for me is not AI.
I think at the moment, basically, when we talk about AI, we're talking about ML because that's what is commoditized, that's what everyone is using. Obviously, artificial intelligence as an umbrella definition covers everything, genetic algorithms, expert systems, all sorts of kind of categories. But at the moment, in the last sort of couple of years, it's machine learning which has become basically dominant solution for a lot of artificial intelligence problems. So we should call it ML. We should just say, I think, how to build a high growth ML startup.
I think that might be something for networking. I think I was just going to give. I think we've got time for one final question actually, and I'll probably give it to somebody else. Yes.
So just extending from the team structure, working with the client to co-create a solution with you, being in the industry, and then probably having a sort of three-way agreement with someone helping put it together. What are the things from IP point of view and other stuff that one should be wary about or to be careful about or consider?
I just to speak to the question a little bit. Did you say a third person helping to pull a startup together?
The client.
To build it. Oh, the client.
Yeah. So it's a client developer collaborations. In order, and it's very common, right? It's very common. The issue in IP assignment is to make that as clean as possible. I mean, in most situations, you can say, even in joint ventures, you can say what happens to the intellectual property that gets developed as a result of that collaboration. You just need to define those rules early on, really. In most cases, the user's getting the benefit that the user's seeking, so they're generally not looking for an IP stake. And if they are, then you need to set up an appropriate structure for that.
Full energy past the party.
So when it comes to companies working with development agencies, and probably you're in a good place to sort of opine on that as well, you typically would want to have the intellectual property assigned within that contractual arrangement. And is that how things are set up?
It is. So we have no interest in owning the IP for any of the stuff we work on. That's something that, in a simple structure, our clients give us money, they get code that's their IP. From our point of view, that's because what we love doing is working with clients to build stuff. And if we take someone's IP and go and build their idea and try and run their business, we're not doing what we enjoy doing.
Yeah, so we build the same thing twice.
Yeah, how do you deal with situations where you have a module that you're reusing to deliver that client's project, and maybe you have even made improvements to that module during the delivery? What happens there?
So we use a lot of open source software, and if what they're trying to build is something that's proprietary to what they're doing, then that would be typically, and it will vary from case to case, but typically that would be something we build that's theirs. But if it's like a side thing that they're leaning on, that other people might lean on, but they don't see it as their core business, then that will often end up going back into the open source library and being published to open source.
Okay.
And so that's a conversation we have with the clients.
Yeah, so
on a case by case.
And I think that's the kind of important point there, is to know exactly as a
what you're building,
what you're getting, and from a developer agency perspective, what you're giving. And you're right, all of those points need to be made clear at the beginning.
Defining clean IP used to be a nightmare, right? Because in the world pre-open source, it's somebody would use a library that was based on something else, and you're getting into a real complex situation. I think if you're going to outsource your development, then one of the contractual components needs to be that the IP needs to be clean, and that means that not that they can't use third-party products, but where they do, they declare them, so that you don't end up in this situation where somebody says, "Yeah, well, that's your IP, but this is my library." Right.
And these sorts of things create real significant problems when it comes to the investment stages for that client, for that customer, for that company, because in those stages, a savvy investor will undertake due diligence on intellectual property, and they will ask questions: do you own your IP? Can you prove it? Where's the documentation? Where's the clean room, basically, with all this material that I can sort of see? So you want to have that all tidied up. You want to have all that tidied up at the beginning, rather than sort of running around at the time of the investment. I'm trying to get development agencies signing assignments, which I have seen happen much too often.
Yeah, and just because something's open source doesn't mean there isn't an embedded license in that too. So be aware of that as well. There are very often situations where there are licenses that are part of an open source arrangement, and the issue is one of fair licensing, which is that everybody gets licensed on the same basis. This is very common in the silicon industry, semiconductor industry. British Telecom made millions out of data modems over the years because they owned a core piece of technology that sat inside those things. So every time a data modem was sold, then BP got a license fee for that. BT rather got a license fee for that. And there are lots of examples of those kinds of things. Particularly interestingly in the entertainment industry, where there are lots of issues around compression technologies, for instance.
One thing I would just follow up with is in the majority of cases that we see in practice, if something's available, particularly in an open source library, it's because it's been used in hundreds and thousands of projects, and so that's probably not likely to be where you want your defendable position to be.
And over the last maybe 10 years, open source licenses have trended towards like MIT or Apache, which are quite business friendly in terms of reuse and inclusion in your project, and don't suffer from some of the viral parts to show those various versions of the GPL do.
I think we're going to have to cut. We've covered a lot of ground, I think, this evening, and I do feel there are quite a lot of burning questions still in the audience. But I think the panel's going to be sticking around, so grab any of them and you know, tackle them one-on-one, as it were. I think if you could also fill in the questionnaire before you go to the further networking and drinking. And I think also, Laurie, you've got a little offer. You'll see a little card in there, but Laurie, you
So on your chair, you'll find a small square card. Let me tell you a little bit about what we're doing with that. If you know about thoughtbot, you'll know that we're big fans of the product design sprint, which is a 5-day process where we help companies like yourselves figure out whether or not they're building the right thing, whether or not it is buildable, whether or not it's going to solve customers' problem. And it's great fun. We love it. Really enjoy it. It's really high energy, but 5 days is quite a big investment for some people. So we're trialing a shorter version of it, which is a 2-hour session where you can come in and you can work with us, and we'll help you work through some of the specific elements of your proposition. Can it be built? Should it be built? Do you think it's going to address your customers' needs? And we'll do that in 2 hours. And because we're experimenting with this, we're going to do a bunch of them for free. So if you're interested, come and talk to, if it's technologically, if your question is technically based, come and talk to Nick. If it's business based, probably come and talk to Gwyn, who's sitting here. And if you're not sure, I can jump in and have a conversation with you as well.
All the panel, I would vouch for being extremely startup friendly, or they wouldn't be here. So as I say, I think you can ask them any questions you have and maybe engage further with them as well in due course. But I'd like to thank the guys, first of all. Thanks very much. If you would like to join us for a few more drinks, we're going to be chucked out of here at about 8:45. If anybody wants to continue the networking, we'll probably go to our old Deep Tech Monday haunt, which is the bar under DeepMind under Google. So back towards King's Cross, it's called Drayton Morgan, and
not enough.
late entrance, yeah. But please join us there to do some further networking. So thank you very much.
His light bulb up there.